Okay, hello guys, this is our last video before the midterm exams. So let's finish this. Alright, we are still in chapter 3, different kinds of obligations. And as you can see, we have already discussed section 1 and section 2. So we are now in section 3 onwards. So this is very short. I simplified it so you can easily understand it. Alright, let's go. A person alternatively bound by different prestations shall completely perform one of them. The creditor cannot be compelled to receive part of one and part of the other undertaking. So, when you study the law, you should always do it like this. I'll move my face here. So when you study it, you should always have what you call a mind map. So it's something like this. So the kinds of obligation, you have your simple and then your compound obligation. Under compound obligation, you have your conjunctive obligation and distributive obligation. And then under distributive obligation, you have your alternative obligation and your facultative obligation. So where are we right now? We are, and let's go back, we are in section 3. Alternative obligations. Alright, so if you see here, these are this alternative obligation falls here in the bottom, and beside it is facultative obligation. Alright, what are the kinds of obligation? You have your simple obligation and your compound obligation. So I'll go back to the chart. It says here kinds of obligation, you have your simple and then your compound. Okay, so let's define one. A simple obligation is one where there is only one obligation. It's like D promised to repair the car of C. D obliged himself to deliver to C a piano. Okay, so that's a simple obligation. On the other hand, a compound obligation is one where there are two or more prestations. So a conjunctive obligation is one where there are several prestations and all of them are due. On the other hand, distributive obligations is one where there are two or more prestations, but it may either be an alternative obligation or a facultative obligation. So I'll just pause right here and I'll go back to the chart. What is a compound obligation? So that's one where there are two or more prestations. So I'll go back to the chart here. What are the kinds of obligation? You have your simple obligation and then your compound obligation. And then your compound obligation is divided into two, your conjunctive obligation and then your distributive obligation. So we'll go back to compound obligation. So compound obligation is divided into two, that's conjunctive and distributive. So here in conjunctive, there are several prestations and all of them are due. So lahat yan kailangan mong gawin, lahat na prestation. On the other hand, distributive obligation is one where there are two or more prestations also, but it may be number one, alternative, one where there are two or more prestations but the performance of only one is sufficient. So magawa mo lang yung isa, okay ka na. On the other hand, yung facultative naman is one where there is only one prestation. So isa lang yung pinapagawa sa'yo ng debtor, but isa lang yung pinapagawa sa'yo, but the debtor may substitute another prestation. Okay, so let's move forward. Alternative obligation is one where there are several prestations due but the performance of one of these prestations is sufficient. So D borrowed 10,000 from C. It was agreed that D may comply with this obligation by either giving C 10,000 pesos. So that means he just has to pay the creditor back, diba? Kaya letter C kasi creditor eh. Giving C 10,000. So yan yung kabayaran dun sa binarrow niya na 10,000 pesos. So kumbaga parang utang ito. Or pwede niyang bigyan na lang ng colored TV si C. Or pinturahan niya na lang yung bahay ni C. So we are assuming na yung colored TV at saka yung pagpipinturan ng bahay, ang worth niyan is 10,000 pesos din, katumbas ng kanyang pagkakautang. In this case, the performance of any of one of them above-mentioned prestations will extinguish the obligation of D to C. Okay? So, napaka-simple. So, parang si debtor nanghiram ng 10,000 kay creditor. Sabi ni na nagkasundo sila na si debtor ay magkakapag-comply ng kanyang obligasyon sa kanyang utang sa pamamagitan ng number 1, pagbayad ng 10,000, number 2, pagbigay ng color TV, or number 3, pipintura ng bahay ng creditor mismo. And kapag nagawa niya any one of these, extinguish na yung kanyang obligation. Okay, so yan yung alternative obligation. Nabalik ulit tayo sa chart ha. Ito yung kinds of obligation, may yung simple, may compound, may conjunctive, tsaka may distributive. Sa distributive, you have alternative obligation and facultative. So, itong alternative, pwede mong gawin kahit ano doon sa tatlo or kung ilan man yung prestation na yon. Okay? Ano yung conjunctive obligation? So, yung conjunctive naman ay there are several prestations and lahat yon kailangan mong gawin. Okay? So, yung sa compound kasi, ang ibig sabihin yan, maraming obligations. So, dito sa conjunctive, may mga prestations dyan, pero lahat yan kailangan mong gawin. Dito naman sa distributive, may mga prestation dyan, kagaya dito sa alternative na maraming prestation, pero kahit na isa lang yung gawin mo, goods ka na. Samantalang dito sa facultative naman, may isang kang prestation, pero pwede mong palitan ng iba pa. Okay, so actually dyan na tayo papunta ngayon sa facultative obligation. Is one where only one prestation has been agreed upon, but the obligor, yung obligor yan yung debtor ha, may render another in substitution. So, I will give you my piano, but I may give you my LCD TV as a substitute. So, in this case, only the piano is due, but the debtor may substitute it with another. So, it's very, very simple. The right of choice belongs to the debtor unless it has been expressly granted to the creditor. So, yung may karapatan na pumili kung ano yung i-comply niya or kanyang gagawin ay yung debtor mismo. The debtor shall have no right to choose those prestations which are impossible, unlawful, or which could not have been the object of the obligation. So ito, ano naman ito, understandable naman na ito. Kasi, hindi naman pwedeng maging object ng contract ang isang imposible or unlawful object, diba? General rule, the right to choose prestation belongs to the debtor. So, exception is if the right to choose prestation may belong to, may belong to the creditor if it is expressly granted to him by the debtor, or it belongs to a third person if it is granted by common agreement. So, lagi niyong tatandaan na yung general rule, pwede yan mapalitan kapag nagkaroon yung agreement, yung parties. Okay? If you're dealing with contracts. Malaking bagay yung pagkakasundo ng parties. Okay, 1201. The choice shall produce no effect except from the time it has been communicated. So, yung epekto ng pagsasubstitute, walang legal effect yon unless na-communicate yon ng debtor sa kanyang creditor. So, for example, S obliged himself to deliver to B his car or his racehorse. Delyon na delyon to. Kabayo na naman ang ating example. S chose the car and properly informed B of his choice. So, in this case, the communication of the seller to the buyer that the seller chose the car converts the obligation into a simple obligation. So, apparently, kapag nirelay mo ay kinommunicate mo na yung yung gusto mong obligation na gagawin ay nako-convert yung obligation into a simple obligation. Okay? That makes sense naman. Okay. 1202. The debtor shall lose the right of choice when among the prestations whereby he is alternatively bound, only one is practicable. If there is only one practicable prestation, the obligation is converted into a simple obligation. Tama naman yan. Okay. Through the creditor's acts, the debtor cannot make a choice according to the terms of the obligation. The latter may rescind the contract with damages. So, for example, the debtor borrowed 10,000 from the creditor. It was agreed that instead of 10,000, the debtor could deliver item 1, item 2, or item 3. If through the fault of the creditor, item 1 is destroyed, D can rescind the contract if he wants to. Okay. So, in this case, yung nagkamali dito is yung creditor mismo. In case of rescission, the amount of 10,000 must be returned by D with interest. And C, in turn, must pay D the value of the item plus damages. Kasi sinira naman ni creditor yung item, di ba? Okay, 1204. The creditor shall have the right to indemnify for damages when through the fault of the debtor, all the things which are alternatively the object of the obligation has been lost, or the compliance of the obligation has become impossible. The indemnity shall be fixed, taking as basis the value of the last thing which has disappeared, or that of the service which last became impossible. Damages other than the value of the last thing or services may also be awarded. Article 1205, when the choice has been expressly given to the creditor, the obligation shall cease to be alternative. Yan, from the day the selection has been communicated to the debtor. Ito yung sinasabi natin kanina, na kapag kinommunicate na ng debtor kung ano yung kanyang, ito pala, ang kino-contemplate pala na situation na to is yung choice, hindi sa debtor kung hindi nasa creditor. Kinonvene na ng creditor kung ano yung gusto niyang prestation doon sa options. Ang sabi dito, the obligation shall cease to be alternative from the day the selection has been communicated by the creditor to the debtor. Until then, the responsibility of the debtor shall be governed by the following rules. So, number 1, if the thing is lost or a fortuitous event, he shall perform the obligation by delivering that which the creditor should choose from among the remainder, if one remains, or that which remains if only one subsists. So, kapag yung ibang options ay hindi na pwedeng gawin through a fortuitous event, mamimili na lang doon sa natirang prestation. Okay, and number 2, if the loss of the thing occurs to the fault of the debtor, the creditor may claim any of those subsisting or the price of that which through the fault of the former has disappeared with right to damages. So dito yung may kasalanan yung debtor mismo. So sabi dito, the creditor may claim any of those subsisting. So kung ano yung natitira, pwede niyang i-claim. Or yung presyo nung nasira plus damages. Number 3, if all the things are lost through the fault of the debtor, the choice by the creditor shall fall upon the price of any one of them, also with indemnity for damages. So, malamang ang kukunin ng debtor dito yung pinakamahal. Ang creditor pala yung pinakamahal. The same rule shall be applied to obligations to do or not to do in case one or some of all the prestations shall become impossible. Okay, Article 1206. When only one prestation has been agreed upon but the obligor may render another in substitution, that is called a facultative obligation. Okay? So, the loss or deterioration of the thing intended as a substitute through the negligence of the debtor does not render him liable. But once the substitution has been made, the obligor is liable for the loss of the substitute on the account of his delay, negligence, or fraud. Okay, so that's the end of the slide. Let's just go back for a bit. Okay, so we actually ended here in alternative obligations. And we will stop here in alternative obligations. And that will be all for now. Thank you and goodbye.